So welcome to the Cumbrian mining town of Keswick. Have you heard that right, Clive? Cumbrian mining town of Keswick? Yeah, alright. It's not Wigan, it's not Jarrah, and it certainly ain't grimy. But it certainly was a mining town, and nearly 500 years ago now they sent Europe's best mining engineers and best miners here to work. Now then, they weren't welcome after a while, as you can imagine. And there was quite a bit of argy-bargy went on. I'm not saying it was a Battle of Orgreave, but one of the German miners actually got stabbed and killed, to the extent that later on the miners went to live on an island. I'm not saying it was because of that, but they went living on Derwentwater Island. Come on, I'll show you where it is. Out there, across there, that was Derwent Island, now owned by the National Trust, but that's where they went to live. And they could grow all their own crops and everything, all their own food, and be self-sufficient on there. And that first sort of spell of mining carried on from the mid-1500s right up until, well, it was Oliver Cromwell and his mates that kind of stopped it with the Civil War, because it was Queen Elizabeth and she was after the copper. So it didn't matter whose land this was, the minerals became hers, they became mines royal. Much to the consternation of some of the real landowners, especially the Percy family from Northumberland. Anyway, there's plenty of good stories in that era that we can come back to another day. Well, let's get to the crux of our story today, which is we're going to go further up Borrowdale to Castle Crag and learn why it's called Castle Crag, and find out about a very interesting guy that used to live there, because now and again history throws up some really interesting people, and Millican Dalton is one of them. So we've come along from the village of Grange and we're now at the foot of Castle Crag, and this area is actually called Gowder Dub. Dub is actually the old word for a pool in the river, and that's exactly what this is. It's the first sort of big bend you get to at the bottom of Castle Crag, and it looks a bit sort of flat today, but I'm telling you, in the spring and summer this is a really beautiful spot. You'll be lucky to get a seat here, and there's always plenty of people playing in the river, swimming because it's deep enough to swim, got the kayaks and inflatables out, and the odd Tarzan swing or two jumping out into the river. Now the name Borrowdale is actually originally Borgdale. Borg being an old word for fort, so you've got fort in the dale, fort in the valley, so Borrowdale Valley. And of course it's all National Trust land now. The National Trust actually got the top of Castle Crag just after the First War, or around about the First War. And the area that we're going to, well, the National Trust got that around about 1939, partly by subscription. It was donated, and then I think they paid for the rest. Now, as I said, for a start we're going to have a look at the fort itself, and we're going to have a look at the industry here, which was Borrowdale Green Slate. So we're going to have a look at a quarry for a start, then we'll make our way up Castle Crag, have a look for the fort, and then hopefully, well not hopefully, we're definitely going to find where Millican lived. Go on, Morgan. This is Dalt Quarry, and here they've been quarrying the Westmorland Green Slate. It's volcanic, so once of a time this was a big lava flow. Very valuable. I can't tell you what it is a ton now, but if you look on our Walking Industrial History, the first sort of series of that, the opening credits, well, that was done up at Hugh Cragg's mine, where they actually mined the green slate, and they mine it all over the Borrowdale Valley because it's that valuable. Yeah, you can quarry it for so far, but then when there gets too much overburden on top of the hill, well, you start following it underground. So once upon a time this was a big lava flow. Well, we're on the Cumbria Way now, following that, and this stretch of the Cumbria Way comes up obviously out the Borrowdale Valley, over the top and into the Langstrath Valley, and then over into Langdales. It's a beautiful stretch of the Cumbria Way. I'm not sure how long the Cumbria Way is, but as I say, we're now on our way up to Castle Crag. And for all you aficionados, know that Castle Crag is one of the Wainwrights. Not the highest, in fact probably the smallest, I think, and some people that write these guidebooks don't even count Castle Crag as a summit. I think they put it with something else. Do they put it with Maidenmore? But anyway, Wainwright didn't. He classed it as a fell on its own. And didn't he say that it was one of the loveliest miles in the Lake District? And that's where we're going to go. We're going to go and have a look up there now and see if we can see the remains of the Iron Age fort. What we will see is plenty of quarrying. And this place was quarried until relatively recently, actually, in the scheme of things. But if you carry on over the Cumbria Way here and then follow Honister Pass all the way up to the top, I mentioned New Crag Mine on one side, didn't I? Well, on the other side there's Honister Mine, which is still working, and we had a right good route round there in the early 90s before it was reopened again. But you can go in now also because they've got a show mine open. As well as producing high quality slate, it produces, well, it's a tourist destination as well, and it's very interesting. You can go underground, see how things are done, watch them make slate, and of course buy slate. But we're going up here now. Well, we're approaching the top now to where the quarry actually was, where they finished off quarrying. I don't know if it was the 1950s, I can't give you a proper date. But anyway, behind us that's the village of Rosthwaite, and we're looking up the Langstrath Valley towards Eagle Crag. And the village of Rosthwaite there, just on a side point, that's where Charlie and Camilla, and Charlie and others, the king now, isn't he? That's where he used to come on his holidays and stay, believe it or not, in a sort of a farm B&B there actually. A true story, I actually got a pint off Mr. Charles. When would it be? 2016? Some of you may be into the royal family, some of you not, one with the other. But anyway, after Storm Desmond and all the problems it caused in Pooley Bridge, it actually knocked the bridge down after 250 years, didn't it? We'd all just been given a tea towel to commemorate 250 years of the bridge, and 4 months later there were no bridge anymore. Anyway, quite a lot of people got introduced to him. He came to the area to try and rejuvenate sort of business and trade and what have you. Give him his due, he did, and we got introduced to him. Anyway, the landlord in the Sun offered him a pint. Obviously it was a good bit of advertising, Jennings beer, wasn't it, you know? So Prince Charles, as he was then, he went up to the bar and said, yeah, I'll have a pint. Well, he actually said, I'll have half a Guinness. And then he said, oh, and perhaps the window cleaner might want one. So I got a pint off Charlie. True story. And you see, it's a slate. People have stood up like gravestones. There doesn't seem to be as many. It looks like a few have been knocked down. But when you see it in a certain light with all the shadows falling in them, it used to look absolutely fantastic. But there's plenty of quarrying remains here. You can even see where they've had the old cabins and the sheds up here. Hard to think, isn't it, that the fact that there's an Iron Age hill fort there, this is in the middle of the Lake District, that it's actually been done. But people had to earn the living. It hasn't always been a tourist area. Real life kind of happened here, you know. plateau at the top. Now, I'm no way an expert in hill forts or archaeology. In fact, I know nought about arcs at all, apart from the one on Blackpool Pleasure Beach. But looking at the stuff I've looked at, it said there's a couple of definite level plateaus on the top, and you can see them round where the War Memorial is, but also there's embankments and earthworks to the south as well. Obviously quite a little bit of it, well, a lot of it's been quarried away in the middle, and there's not a great deal to see, but if you were really into archaeology, you'd be able to see it plain as day. But obviously, defensively, it was a very strategic place. The people would be safe up here. And you've got commanding views all around the fell sides. So this was an Iron Age hill fort. Right, so we're kind of getting where we want to be now. Now the thing about Millican Dalton, people say that he lived in a cave, but he didn't live in a cave. He lived in a slate mine. To be more precise, a close head. Well, you've been a bit pedantic, Clive, aren't you? It's a cave, what's wrong with that? Well, it's a bit like saying to Tiger Woods, well, what's your favourite golf bats? A mine is a mine, and a close head is a close head. But behind us we've got another view of Rosthwaite, the village, and behind it is you're going up the Langstrath Valley and Eagle Crag. And in the 1500s or before, there was actually an iron bloomery there where they smelted iron ore. Because this land, a lot of it used to belong to Furness Abbey, which is 50 mile away at least. But they used to exploit, so it was thought, iron ore in the Lake District. And if you've ever walked up some of the places, especially up towards Angletown and what have you, there at Windy Gap, you've got Ore Gap up there. We can definitely see a massive vein of iron ore going down towards Angletown. So there was a bloomery over there. I've never actually found it yet though. I need to go and look a bit better. But let's just have a quick look at this slate mine, not a slate cave. This is the old powder magazine. Great to see, isn't it? So, see what I mean when you get off the beaten track a little bit and just don't do the summits? It's surprising what you do find. But come on, it's time to go and introduce everybody to Millican Dalton. And I'll tell you a little bit about him as we go from here to his home. Now, the young Millican in 1871 on the census, he was born in 1867, but on the census in 1871, he's living at Fowlards here in Nenthead. I haven't actually looked up the exact place of his christening, or where he's registered at his birth. But this is where Fowlards is, and there's one or two different properties called Fowlards. The original one is down there in the trees, and there's Fowlards Rig at the top here, but there seems to be on the census 4 or 5 houses under that kind of name, and now all the cottages have got different names. The names have changed, so it's possible he could have lived further down. But you can see from the area he must have got his love for the open air and rain, living in Borrowdale, from being brought up in Nent. Now it's quite possible that it's a house behind us, because that's called Fowlards Cottage still. Behind that again is Wellgill Cottage, then across the other road, I think that's called something Villas. Now if we look on the census, he lives next door to the Waltons, mine agents, and the Waltons, they own the Brownlee Hill mine. But if you look at Millican's dad, he says that he's a lead mine agent, he's a lead smelting agent. And Fowlards Cottage is behind us, that's the white cottage, but it says that he lived next door to the Waltons. Now I don't know how old the next house down is, Wellgill, but the one across the road I'm sure is called Villas, and if you look on that census you'll see that. So obviously Millican came from a decent upbringing. If his dad was a lead smelting agent, obviously he had a decent position. Maybe that's something to look into more. But sadly Millican isn't really celebrated in his on his home turf, sadly. But I bet there's a lot more to his background. It looks like his dad came from Appleby actually. Millican was actually born in the April of 1867, and he was the 6th son of William Dalton and Frances Dalton. Now Frances, her granddad had been John Vipond Millican, and he had been the superintendent of the Nenthead and Weardale and Stanhope mines for the London Lead Company. And it's through the Lead Company really that we get the Society of Friends, or the Quaker connection. Now, Ulstermore itself, for a start round about the 1200s, was in the hands of the de Vetriponts, who were obviously of Norman descent. They were mates, or the descendants of the mates of Duke Bill, who handed out the lands up here to his bosom buddies kind of thing. Big do's and little do's. If we get further down the time, the land belonged to the Earl of Derwentwater, and I don't mean this Derwentwater here, it's sort of the Derwentwater lands over Northumberland and Durham. However, his political views put him at odds with the Crown, because he backed one of the Jacobite rebellions, and as a result he lost everything. He paid the price for it, and he lost his lands. Now the lands ended up in the hands of, let me get this right, the Greenwich Hospital, basically the Greenwich Hospital for retired seamen or something like that, but it was the Greenwich Hospital. Now they leased out the lead mines, they leased out all the minerals, and one of the biggest companies that took over at a certain point was the London Lead Company, and they were basically a company made up of Friends or Quakers. So that's how we get the Quaker connection to the North Pennines. And they built, we won't say model villages, that's not the right thing to do, but obviously there was a certain ethos behind everything. They built reading rooms, they were interested in the betterment of society, if you will, although the way they paid people left people in debt. But nevertheless, the London Lead Company ran the Ulstermore mines for a long time, and the Daltons, they were part and parcel of that particular setup. So Millican had obviously taken his mother's maiden name as his first name, and he was first educated at Nenthead School. It's there to see these days, isn't it still? And then from then, after his father's death, I think it was after his father's death, he then went to Brookfield School in Wigton. Now that's where he was where he got his Quaker education. It said that William didn't bring his sons or his family up in the Quaker tradition, or he didn't get them to follow the religion, but obviously they had a Quaker education, and certainly that's where Millican got a lot of these views and values that materialised later in life through his time at Brookfield and associating with the people of that sociology. Now Millican obviously didn't go into the mining industry. The family moved down to London, And Millican actually got a job working in an insurance office for, I think it was fire insurance. But he obviously had a love for the mountains and everything to do with mountaineering, hiking, camping. He even claimed to have invented charts, although Baden-Powell also made that claim. But anyway, him and his brother used to make lightweight camping equipment, and apparently they did quite well selling these things. Now in the winter of 1897, Millican, his brother, and a friend of theirs was camping up at Westwater, and their intention was to do Pillar. So this particular day they went up Pillar to do Pillar Rock, and it had been snowing previously, and so there was scabby bits of snow all over the place. It wasn't totally covered in snow, but when they got to a ridge, that was totally covered in snow. And they started to go down a gully overlooking Ennerdale, and his brother got down the gully first, and it was quite dangerous really, we can imagine, full of snow and ice and what have you. And Millican came down next, and then their friend came down. Now when the friend came down, he sort of thought, wow, look at this, it's great this. And Millican said that he adopted a peculiar gait, what they call the little man. So I get it that he kind of crouched down. Now when we were kids and we were playing at school when it snowed and ice, and we'd make slides all over the school playground, and we'd pride ourselves in getting them up to bottle ice. And then you'd go and you'd run like mad and you'd slide, but you'd crouch right down. And we used to call it doing the granny. So kids ask you what you did when you were young. We went granny sliding. Explain that one to them. So it looks like that's what the guy did. He got right down on his haunches, you see. But as he was sliding down on his haunches, he slipped onto his back and he started flying down the hill, down the gully towards the precipice. Fortunately, Millican's brother managed to grab hold of him and stop him at the vital moment. So there we are. There was a close call for them. But Millican's life was to change just, well, that was 1897 in the winter time. Well, his life was to change just 6 years later, dramatically. I'll tell you how. In 1903, in the words of John Fogerty and Creedon's Clearwater Revival, he left a good job in the city, working for the man every night and day, but he never lost a minute of sleeping, wondering about the things that there might have been. Because he then became the professor of adventure. He left his previous life behind and took on his first love, which was mountaineering and the outdoors. And for a start, he went to live in and around Epping Forest in a cabin, and he did tours. He advertised to do tours around Switzerland, around glaciers, the Alps, well, the Alpine regions anyway. I'm not saying he went to the Alps, he could well have done. And back here in Cumbria, in the Lake District, he did outdoor courses, if you will, for people. That was then his mission in life. He camped at Wasdale Head, like we mentioned with the trip up Pillar. But he also had a camp above Lodore Falls. And then at one stage, he left the camp at Lodore Falls and moved here to Borrowdale, to this particular spot. Now this is High Quarry, and that is High Slate Mine really. It's just a small close head, but this was High Quarry, and it's on the First Ordnance Survey map. Looks to be working as a quarry, and behind me you can see the remains of a couple of cabins, and they're on it. Now the close head itself looks like two caves. There's two openings that are joined in between, and that is where Millican made his home. Now don't think that he lived rough. Those people that knew him said he was very capable, and he made this place extremely comfortable. It had all the amenities. He had a lovely bed made of bracken and leaves, and he really promoted the use of down when it came to keeping warm in the winter and the summer. Now in 1909 a bit of a disaster had happened. He brought a party up and they were camping up at Wasdale Head. And one of the members of the party was a Mr. Renison, who was an assistant to a chemist. And he was a rock climber, he was an experienced rock climber, but he didn't have quite the skills. Now on this particular day, they were going to climb Eagle Crag, or is it Eagle Crag Springs? I'm not a rock climber, so I can't tell you all the locations, but it was on Great Gable. Now, he was suffering with his feet from the night before because his boots were hurting him, so he actually borrowed Millican's boots. Now they set off early in the morning, and just turned 8 o'clock. I think they were starting to climb Nape's Needle, which was one of Millican's favourite climbs, and they finished that, and by 9 o'clock they were heading, or 9:40, they were heading towards Eagle Rock for a bit of breakfast. Now Millican didn't do the climb, obviously somebody else had his boots. They made it up the first 20 feet or so, which was a scramble, not a problem, and then they started climbing again, and Mr. Renison, he'd scramble up, started climbing maybe about a dozen feet, and then he fell. And as he fell, the rope snapped. The guy below him was confident when he saw him fall that he would hold him on the rope, but the rope broke about 6 inches above his hands. Renison fell, hit the rocks about 3 times, and by the time they got to him, he was quite dead. So that was a real tragedy, wasn't it, really, for Millican, who at the time was still bivouacking if you're living down in Billericay. But let's get and have a look at his house here on Castle Crag and delve into him just a bit more, shall we? This is it, the Cave Hotel, as it was sometimes known. I can assure you, it was part of the quarry. We'll see some shot holes. And it was divided into 2 really, the upper cave and the lower cave. There's another bit of an entrance up a height there we'll have a look at. As you can see, it's decayed a little, hasn't it? And the upper bit, apparently he used as a spare bedroom, but there's some of his interesting graffiti up there. So this is where he lived, and now it can be a bit of a chavvy campsite with all the litter and the obligatory Foster's cans left all over. But let's see if we can find a shot hole. There we are. You see there, the shot hole? There's a couple around here as well. They drilled it in, maybe the hand jumper, I don't know. Possibly if we're going way back there to the 1800s, it'd be a hand jumper to get in and blow the slate off with a cleat of it. And this is the upper chamber. There's one before it said it was the guest room. I think some people would be annoyed if they turned up and found this, wouldn't they, at the Hilton? But let's have a look at his graffiti. It's just here on the side. So if you'd booked up on one of Millican's holidays, what could you look forward to? I'll give you a little bit of a taster, shall I? Here we are. Mr. Dalton conducts parties of pioneers through the wild of this country at a most reasonable figure. His holiday arrangements have the breath of the veld. He lashes boughs together and rafts it on Derwentwater. He talks of a 3-day trek across Rannoch Moor. He will arrange to take you through the dark defile of the pass of the Glencoe at midnight. His programmes include such thrills as a Sinbad the Sailor, right for a photographic postcard at 3D, lost in the mountain mist, dangling over a precipice, and varying hairbreadth escapes arranged by circumstance. So that's what you could look forward to both in this country and similar things across in Switzerland, especially the land of the area of Tyrol. He wore a Tyrolean hat, and he wore a Tyrolean hat homemade shirts, homemade shorts and booties. He never wore socks. Well, he did once. I'll tell you about that in a minute. He mentioned whitewater rafting there, didn't he? And he actually did. But what he did, he had his own little raft called Rogue Harris. And apparently he found some big trees at the side of the lake Derwentwater, and apparently it took 5 men to get these logs in the water, and he wrapped them together, lashed them together, and he made his own raft by the name of Rogue Harris. Now Rogue Harris, the name was taken from a novel by Hugh Walpole, and it's based in the Lake District. It's based in Borrowdale. Dare I say it's a Borrowdale version of the Mallons. I might get hung for that. But anyway, it is based around the years round about the 45 Jacobite rebellion, either side of that, and one particular man by the name of Harris, who's a bit of a rogue. Tell you what, it's quite a good read actually. But Millican, not only did he do whitewater rafting, but he would take people out on midnight paddles across Derwentwater on Rogue Harris. And he had a plaid, like a Scottish plaid, and he would put that up and use it as a sail. Like I said, he had lots of time for other people. He was no recluse. And he befriended a lady by the name of Mabel Mary Barker, who was a school teacher. And originally he met her. I say he befriended her, maybe that's the wrong thing to say. They became great friends. She was a school teacher and she was leading a party of schoolgirls from, I think it was Saffron Walden. And Millican taught them mountain climbing. And they became firm friends after that, did Mabel and Millican, till the end of his life really, and she wrote a lovely obituary for him. But I mentioned also about socks, him wearing a pair of socks. He wore the socks at a wedding. It was a local wedding, again, for friends. I think Mabel Barker was part of the party. I'm not saying she was one of the relatives, but anyway, we're getting away with that, aren't we? He was best man at the wedding, and the night before the wedding, the groom actually stayed here with him in the mine here, and his wedding breakfast was broiled chicken. And at the wedding, Millican was there, as I say, was best man, but he was still in his shorts, but he put a pair of socks on like he promised, and he had his ropes and everything ready to go climbing afterwards, as did the bride and groom. And afterwards, after the wedding, Millican went straight outside and took his socks off, and they spent the rest of the day climbing round here. Those are the things that they loved. And just imagining the summer months, waking up every morning, coming out your house and getting this view, 4 o'clock and a lovely fresh morning, with the sound of all the wildlife. It must have been gorgeous. Towards the end of his life, Millican said he didn't sleep a great deal, and he laid half the night just listening to the wildlife as he slept in the cave. In fact, he once complained during the Second World War, near the end of his life as well. He sent a letter to Churchill telling him to stop the war. As we know, having a Quaker upbringing, he was a pacifist. But let's just have a look a bit deeper to see what sort of a man he was and try and get a bit more of his character. In his later years, Mabel said that he became increasingly argumentative. And we know he had strong views, but perhaps the argumentative bit came from getting older. That tends to happen, doesn't it? But they still enjoyed been with him, and they would look forward to every summer waiting to see wisps of blue smoke coming up from this particular area, which you could see all along the Borrowdale road there, and they knew that he had arrived again for the summer and that they were in for a treat. And they used to enjoy, as all his friends did, coming up, sitting around the campfire here. And Millican was addicted to two things: coffee and woodbines, and he drank thick black coffee. So, but he was a vegetarian as well. He would forage for nuts. He knew where to find all the food around Derwentwater and Borrowdale. So he kept himself in shape, apart from the woodbines as well. And he was a regular sight with his bike going up to the shop in Rosthwaite or down into Keswick for some supplies. And he was a well-known figure. But I'll just put this point across. When I was looking into this a little bit, a lady from the Caving magazine had wrote something. How would you go on today being able to camp here? If Millican wasn't who he was, how would the authorities, the local authorities, have put up with other people? Would they, if it were working people from the north of England, would they have allowed them to camp? Would they have allowed Romanists to camp here? The only person that really complained about Millican was an air raid warden when he could see light of his campfire. So there are a few questions to ask why he was allowed to do what he was allowed to do. Well, I suppose that's just a bit of an aside point, isn't it? He certainly wasn't frightened of airing his views if he was going to write to Churchill. And there was at one time there was a debate going on in the newspapers about the morality of ladies, in particular the things that they wore. And it was all about cycling and cycling shorts, that ladies should not be wearing trousers to go on bikes. They should be wearing skirts. So of course Millican got involved in this, and he wrote back to the paper, quite a lengthy section actually, and he sort of said, well, I run caving holidays and I do mountaineering, and he said ladies have to wear trousers. They all wear trousers. In fact, he said, I was walking down the street the other day and I saw a Chinese lady who thought nothing about wearing trousers. Indeed, he said, the man who has complained about this indecency ought to try mountaineering and cycling in skirts himself. So he was quite forthright with what he said. He wasn't afraid to. I wonder what they'd make of lycra cycling shorts these days. But another thing he wrote to the newspaper, you could think he was a bit of a Luddite, but he wasn't. You have to take it in context of the times. You could have said he was anti-science. And I'll read you this, actually, from the newspaper. Obviously, it was a reply to a letter that had already been in there. And it's headline, Critic of Science, signed by Millican Dalton of Marlow in Buckinghamshire. Science is not wisdom. Professor Jeans does not even understand the anti-scientists' arguments. Only a small portion of scientific knowledge is useful for human life. Much is too abstract, useless, and even destructive. Scientific specialists lack the guidance of wisdom and have no talent or qualifications for guiding social, what's that last word there? Social references or something. It's just over the thingy. But you get the idea. So you could think that he was a bit of a Luddite. But if you take it in context of the time, now I've just been going through George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, and in his second section of the book, Orwell talks about machines, and he's quite anti-machine, and when you read it you think, goodness me, I didn't think he was like this. But it was within the context of the time. And one of the adverts for Millican's adventures, he said that he was a well-known leftist. Well, obviously he was a contemporary of Orwell, and Millican was he was a great admirer of George Bernard Shaw's work. Now, George Bernard Shaw was classed as a working class sort of socialist, but when you read some of his plays and his books, sometimes the working person is ridiculed a little bit. And also George Bernard Shaw, like a lot of them at that time, which is quite disturbing, had association with the eugenics movement. Now, I'm not for 1 minute saying that Millican had any sympathies there, but socialism back in those days, you could think of socialism really as like a lot of striking miners, dockers and what have you. But if you go to the first Labour government, there in 1946, many of Attlee's cabinet were actually ex-public school. Orwell himself described himself as, was it upper lower middle class? So, and he himself said that many a working miner from the north of England, if he went down to London and went to some of these socialist meetings, he'd wonder where on earth he was. So we've got to take Millican's sort of letter, anti-science, in context with the time. And anyway, we all know these days that science can be bought, can't it? Now Millican lived until his 80th year, 1947, and it got to the stage really where staying here wasn't doing his chest any good. It is said, I've read it in other places, that his cabin down in London in Epping Forest burnt down shortly before he died. Well, a bit of research leads you to find that his cabin actually burnt down in 1939. A gang of school kids found it on fire and they tried to put it out with buckets of water, but they couldn't, unless of course he had another cabin that went up in smoke. But he died in 1947, and he died in hospital of, I believe it was chest complaints, was it pneumonia? So that was a sad end to him, really. And he actually wrote a book. He looked at life, he said of life it was a scientific experiment, and his book, was it entitled The Philosophies of Life? But it was there at his bedside when he died, and sadly it disappeared. But one of the nicest obituaries really, and remembrances of him, was written by Mabel Barker, and she said, there now, she said, the cave is waiting, the bed is made, the down eider down is there waiting for him, and his campfire is ready stacked. But they knew that he was never going to come back to it. So Millican Dalton, there you are, 80 years old, from 1867, a son of Nenthead and a professor of adventure, and a real character out of history. Yeah, a bit of a mixture in his views and of his time, but surely a man to be celebrated. So I hope you've enjoyed this. And it hasn't been the best weather, has it? It's improved a bit now, but sometimes it's good to see the Lake District as it really is. And back in the old days when these quarries were working and the old mines were working, there was no such thing as Gore-Tex and Jack Wolfskin, you know. The men climbed these fells in clogs and dead men's overcoats and flat caps. Thanks for watching. We'll try and find another adventure for you next time. Go on, Morgan.